For nearly 6 years, Staff Sergeant Frank Wuterich waited to have his day in a military courtroom. His lawyer, Neal Puckett, a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel, joins me now to talk about the plea. Thank you for being here, Neal.
You're welcome.
So take us back about a week or so, that weekend, before your client did plead guilty. What did you ask him to consider?
We got an offer from the prosecutors that in exchange for his plea of guilty to negligent dereliction of duty, that we could basically resolve the case in one day and he would not receive any jail time. And so we asked him whether or not he wanted to do that. Of course, by that time, we were well into the case, in fact, almost finished with the case, and felt like we could win the case, felt like we could get an acquittal. But it was his desire to plead guilty, primarily solely to take responsibility for everything that happened that day, to take responsibility for his Marines, his own tactical decisions, because he felt that he was in some measure morally responsible for things going bad that day.
Now, this wasn't the first time this particular charge came up through this entire 6-year process, was it? There were other times where you offered to your client would, in fact, plead guilty to this. What did the prosecution say?
Well, this wasn't the first time he'd heard this, because a couple of years ago, we actually drew up some paperwork and offered to plead guilty to a very similar level of offense in exchange for light punishment, and the prosecution turned it down. We revisited the issue last year, and again, the prosecution turned it down. And so when it came time to talk about it this time, after they had put on 3/4 of their case and it wasn't going very well for them, I think they made the decision that it was time to end it.
Now, you've seen the coverage, obviously your client has, in terms of people responding that this in fact was not justice, that 24 Iraqi civilians died. I know there is some controversy over whether there was a man in a wheelchair or not a man in a wheelchair who was also killed. There were women, there were children. How do you respond to that, that in fact this was not justice, that still you had 24 people who died and nobody went to prison?
Well, first of all, there are 10,000 pages at least of investigation, and nowhere in there do the words wheelchair appear, so I don't know where anyone got the idea of wheelchair. However, remember that there were several Marines who fired their weapons that day, in addition to Staff Sergeant Frank Wuterich. Those Marines were all had their charges dismissed through prosecutorial decisions. It's our feeling that perhaps, first of all, you can't look at the entire case by one court-martial result, by that of Staff Sergeant Frank Wuterich. If you look at that and you say, well, 24 people died that day, and look at the light punishment, he's not even going to jail. What you have to consider is, why didn't the government, through its prosecutors, prosecute every Marine who fired their weapon that day? It's our belief that had every Marine gone to trial, we don't know what the outcome would have been. Maybe some would have been acquitted, maybe some would have been convicted, but through the crucible, if you will, of a court-martial, of a courtroom, a lot of times facts come out and juries discover what happened and what didn't happen, and that's very valuable information. And it's possible, we can't redo history, but it's possible that if some Marines had gone to trial, and if some Marines had been convicted, and if some Marines had been punished, perhaps the Iraqi people might feel differently about the outcome of this case, because it's not just the Wuterich case.
So what is it in those 10,000 pages of testimony that perhaps you know and your client knows that has not been revealed in a courtroom?
Well, the problem is those answers can never officially be known. We have theories about what happened, but one of the problems in us being able to not know either is Frank Wuterich wasn't in every room in every house that day. In fact, he didn't fire his weapon in the house, in either house where people died. So things that went on outside of his vision, he has no way of knowing what happened. And to this day, he believes that his Marines followed the rules of engagement as best they could, and did the best they could that day, but a tragic result ensued. So we're not so sure.
Were there Marines who should have been charged in that house, but were not charged?
No, there were Marines who were charged, but in their headlong rush to convict the senior man, Staff Sergeant Wuterich, the prosecutors offered to dismiss the charges and grant immunity to the other Marines in exchange for their testimony against Frank Wuterich.
So in your opinion, should that have happened, or should other Marines have actually gone to court so that these facts could have been revealed?
Well, two things would have happened if all the Marines had gone to court-martial. One is some measure of justice might have been achieved. And two is, if all the facts came out, again, in the crucible and the truth-finding process of a court-martial, perhaps our client wouldn't have gone to trial on the more serious charges. Perhaps the government would have seen, if there were bad actors that day, who those bad actors were, and they might have reduced the charges from the very beginning. We wouldn't have even had to start this 4-week court-martial.
I don't want to ask you the same question over again, but I sense that for the people at home, just to clarify what we're discussing now, that perhaps, in your words, if there were bad actors that day in the House, that we'll never know that because of a decision for those Marines not to go to court.
Understand that I'm not accusing anyone of bad actions or criminal actions. I'm not saying that. Well, what I am saying is that because Marines had their charges dismissed and they were given grants of immunity from the government, we'll never know results of their trials to better find out the truth of what happened in rooms where weapons were fired where Frank Wuterich could not see.
Finally, where is your client now, and what are his plans for the future?
Well, he's still going to work every day at Camp Pendleton. He plans to process out of the Marine Corps in the coming weeks. We trust with an honorable discharge. And he plans to enter the information technology field. He's been doing some training and has some networking certifications, and he's looking for a job. If anybody out there has a job in the IT field, give me a call.
Thank you so much, Neal Puckett.
My pleasure.